Welcome back to the Fordham Sports Analytics Roundup. I am your host, Chris Orlando. Today, I'm excited to introduce Nick Ercolano, the creator of Big Dogs Gotta Eat, aka BDGE, fantasy football's first lifestyle brand. He covers dynasty, redraft, best ball strategies, and other content. Graduate of Marist College, and then got his MBA at Binghamton, and then created BDGE several years later. If you guys aren't familiar with it, BDGE, Big Dogs Gotta Eat, has over 90,000 subs on YouTube and over 500K on TikTok. Nick, if you want to introduce yourself a little bit more on what you've been doing in the space.
Yeah, sure. So like you said, we cover as a brand. We try to go around the clock, around the calendar when it comes to fantasy football stuff, off season, summer, in season, all that stuff. And when we call BDGE, the first fantasy football lifestyle brand, what we're trying to do is provide really good fantasy content year round, but also pretty much document the process of us trying to build this up, whether it's the YouTube channel or the business or anything that we're passionate realistically about. And we hope that our audience can resonate and connect with us, because it's cool to build an audience around fantasy and around this game in particular. But I've found as a creator, it's a lot more meaningful when you could, help people get through things that are bigger than just football. And a lot of times we'll bring our audience in through that as a top of the funnel type of thing, and then connect with them on a deeper level through the other types of content on a more personal level. So, I've kind of gone, my career has been a little weird. I think anyone who's probably in the content space is probably a little bit weird in the head, but I've gone through entry-level business jobs. I've gone through the marketing path in terms of corporate jobs. And then while I was doing that, was creating content on the side about fantasy. I was very, very passionate about it at a pretty young age. And I just found content to be a way for me to express myself. And I kind of just stuck with it. And then since then, we've fortunately been able to grow an audience and turn this into a real business.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, that kind of goes into my next question. But yeah, again, obviously BDG has grown significantly over all social media platforms, the podcast especially. What was your goal when you first started it, your vision, as well as what progress have you seen the company made, and since you've looked into starting it?
Yeah, I don't think I really had a goal when I started, to be honest. I think it was just, again, a way for me to get my thoughts out in a way that I felt comfortable. And when I was growing up, it was kind of tough for me to express myself. It was tough for me to show my vulnerabilities and really be present with people, in relationships and stuff at a younger age. And as soon as I started making content, I felt very freed. I just felt very comfortable on camera and when I was recording and stuff like that. So when I started, it was a way for me to articulate myself, a way for me to, show my humor. It was a way for me to do all that kind of stuff. So I didn't really have any sort of numerical goal or business goal when I started. I know by the time I left my actual corporate full-time job, I think anyone's basis level of goal would be to, hey, let me replace my salary financially so that I can continue to do the stuff that I love, while still making money and being able to supplement my lifestyle and, have friends and go out and go on vacations and trips and buy any of the new tech or whatever shit that you want in your life. Right. So I think basic starting level was that. It was just, it felt good for me to do it. So I just, when you find something that you like to do, when you find something that you're passionate about, you should keep doing it. And the financial goal was very, very minimal at the start. It was really just to replace that, entry level type salary. And, we've grown. It's weird because I've just been doing the same thing basically every day, day in and day out for, I don't know, 8-10 years now. So when I look at it, of course I could take a step back and be wow, we've grown so much. But for me, it's one of those things where you look in the mirror every day. You don't see yourself growing, right? You don't see all these new things that are happening to you physically. That's kind of the way I feel about our business, right? It's hard for me to step back and be wow, we've accomplished so much, because I have so much more that I want to accomplish. And there's not anything finite. There's no end game. There's no result that I want that will make me happy. So for me, it's not, I don't know. I guess it's cool to step back and look at it, but I'm so much in the process that that kind of stuff doesn't really resonate with me.
Absolutely. And you definitely reach a good audience to start out, at least, obviously you mentioned that you started out at entry level pay, and obviously that kind of motivation to really like get into the space. And, it's definitely reached me. I got my Big Dogs hoodie on right now.
Yeah,
We were
you
talking about
must have
that.
been around for a minute because I feel like
Yeah.
we haven't sold those in years.
Yeah, no, I mean, I saw this because this is like my favorite color, and I like kind of looked that you kind of mentioned it, a little merch drop on the YouTube, and I was like, might as well take advantage of this.
Let's
But
go. I love it.
yeah. So now moving into the more analytical stuff. So that's where our club kind of bases on. So as we're moving to, and we're obviously in the off season now, but as you prepare towards the season, what like kind of statistical analysis and breakdown do you guys look for, like use most in the and you just when you guys are creating content and trying to appeal to that to your users?
Yeah, so I guess the way I would go about breaking down players is most of the time I have an overall feel on a player, right? Like I have I'll take player X or player Y and I'll say like, man, I really don't like this dude going into the year. I'll look at where he's getting drafted and say, whatever, maybe it's an ADP where I'm comfortable with and I feel indifferent about it. So I don't feel like the need to dive into his analysis at all. But typically I'll take a player and it'll be a guy I either like or dislike. And then I'll try to back that up with numbers to see if what I saw, because a lot of times we watch football, right? And we only see like a very limited sample size of that player playing, right? We might just see clips on Red Zone each Sunday and we form our basis on that. Like there's no one really out there outside of like maybe 12 dudes in the industry that actually rewatch every single game, every play of all of these players. So we can objectively be like, listen, we don't watch every single snap of this player. We're not getting all the context behind this player. We probably need to do a little bit of a deeper dive. So I will pick a player. I will say, okay, this is my thesis on him going into the year. And that thesis typically comes, there's something inside your brain that's telling you why you feel that way, right? It's like, man, he doesn't get a lot of goal line carries, or man, he doesn't get targeted down the field often. And when I have those specific, they're almost like pillars for your argument for each player. So for each player, I might think of like 4 or 5 arguments. It could be 2, it could be 12. I don't really know. It's just however I feel about the player. And then I'll go into the websites that provide you deeper numbers and deeper analytics on it, whether it's PFF, their premium stuff, whether it's Sports Info Solutions, any advanced analytic website, to try to conjure as many stats that either back up or argue against my original thesis. And I'll change my opinion if I'm wrong about that. If I'm like, man, I wish like Alvin Kamara had a dip in touchdowns this year, right? He only scored 4 touchdowns or whatever. Is that because he got unlucky on the goal line? Or was it because simply he only saw 3 goal line carries this year? They had a shift in philosophy where Taysom Hill took 12 of them and they had a bigger back that took 14 of them or whatever. And can we expect that going into next year? So that's kind of the way my thought process works on a very like bird's eye level.
Absolutely. And you mentioned a good point there, Alvin Kamara at the beginning of the season. Like obviously he was getting a decent amount of goal line carries, and then kind of that random coaching change that we see like later on in the year, maybe an injury might happen, etc. Like we have no idea what these coaches are thinking. So obviously using any kind of statistical background that we can potentially get on a player, obviously, as you mentioned, it's an advantage that we can definitely take advantage of. Now moving more towards just like the specific stats. So, yards per route run, air yards, expected fantasy points, route participation, anything involving volume regression. Like we see like these stats constantly thrown around in the fantasy football space. What kind of stats are you seeing that are kind of emerging within the space? That you see a lot of other content creators are using, or just people that are following the industry, as well as what you might be interested in utilizing moving forward?
Yeah, this shit kind of drives me crazy. I'll be honest with you. Everyone's like trying to create and invent their own stats, and they'll just like tag the word predictive onto it, and then everybody just like flocks around it. If someone says something is predictive, then everyone just uses that for the next 5 years. Is that if that's like the basis argument for everything? So what I've learned, or what the way I've approached this is a lot of those stats, like okay, yards per route run is better than just yards per reception for a lot of reasons, right? It has more context to it, but there are also like 15 stats that are more contextual than yards per route run. And we can keep going deeper and deeper. I think at the end of the day, the problem with all these stats is that I don't play fantasy baseball. I don't play fantasy basketball, but I imagine a lot of the statistics are easier to use and easier to manipulate data with because the sample size is way bigger. Football, it's a 16 game sample size that you have, 17 games now that you have. It's like one slip of a player can so significantly impact he might go from like 32nd in yards per route run down to 12th because like the D-back slipped on a play and he scored an 80-yard touchdown. And no one's going to have the context behind that, which is why these stats, I generally try to look at a trend of a player. So again, if I'm going back to one of the pillars of a player's stats that I want to back up or go against, I won't just look at one data point. I'll be like, okay, this dude's extremely elusive. All right. So I want to look at multiple websites to look at their different like elusive ratings, what they categorize as like a missed tackle force or whatever, broken tackle force, all that kind of stuff. So I want to gather as many data points as I possibly can to make sure what I'm looking at is correct, not just one thing that one person said was predictive one time on Twitter. So it's like, okay, I want to gather 1 or 2 points from 3 to 4 different websites to make sure that it's all trending in the right direction. When you're looking at data graphs, you want to see, the trend line where that's going rather than bullet points here and here and here and here that tell 7 different stories. And if you can't paint a picture with 6 different data points, then the data point itself is probably not a good indicator of like the way you feel on a player. So I think obviously the more contextual you can get with a data point, I think, one of our channel co-hosts, Noah, does a lot of great work. He's like making up his own contextual metrics now with a lot of the rookie running backs, where he takes into account how many defenders are in the box on a specific run play, how good this running back is relative to the other running backs in the backfield when there's 6 guys in the box. And I think stuff like that, like innovating in the industry, taking as much context into each statistic as you can, not saying like, okay, again, this one dude said this thing was predictive, let's fucking ride this for the rest of our lives. That's where this industry just like falls short, and it becomes such an echo chamber where it's almost not worth listening to 99% of the stuff that's out there.
For sure. And, as obviously you guys aren't necessarily using a lot more analytical stuff, but like in terms of modeling, as we would do, for example, you want to add as many independent variables, adding on to those columns at the end of the model, just to kind of create more of a sample size, because as you mentioned, it's only a 16-game season. There's only so much we can develop on a player. That's a very good point as you made. And Noah is doing a great job over there with his dynasty content, I must add. As we were shifting more into dynasty, we talked a little bit about more redraft and best ball stats, or just fantasy football stats as a whole. What kind of emerging metrics are you seeing now in dynasty specifically? We're seeing a lot of content creators push out a weighted adjusted speed score, college production, breakout ages, target share. Like what kind of things are you looking for more specifically in a dynasty perspective in comparison to maybe a redraft one?
Yeah. So I think those are all good indicators. In a sense, I think for every stat that we think is awesome, breakout age or whatever, I think there's also a ton of context you can put behind it. It's like, okay, he broke out at 18, but what percentage of that breakout was via touchdowns versus receptions or yards? And then there's 17 different formulas you can create based on that stuff. I had, I don't know if you're familiar with Nate Liss. He used to work at Player Profiler.
Yeah.
So I had him on the channel earlier this week to do a rookie dynasty draft. Yeah. And he said, he does a lot of work with numbers, and he's created a bunch of apps to try to find out predictiveness of players coming in. And he said the single most predictive stat that he has found up to this point is literally fantasy points per game as a college player. And I'm like, kind of makes sense, because fantasy points, it comes from the same place, right? It's like you're a big piece of your offense. If you're scoring a lot of fantasy points, you're probably scoring a lot of touchdowns in real life. Therefore, like, the coach is comfortable giving you goal line carries. The coach is comfortable, scheming something for you at that part of the field, which probably means that coaches at the next level will also be at least semi-comfortable doing that as well. So I think there's a lot of common sense lost when people try to get really, really analytical. And I think that's one of the numbers I'll probably be looking at moving forward. I like to look at people who specifically zone in on positions, like Noah does running backs. Matt Harmon does like reception perception, which I think is really, really cool, and shows like the separation rates versus man versus press versus zone, and their success rate versus those, because that basically takes out a lot of like any need for statistical outliers in terms of, like quarterbacks overthrowing a wide receiver. It's like, did he separate against his man or whatever like that? So I like people who dive into specific positions and make that like their thing. I think there's a lot to learn from those people.
For sure, yeah, and make sure you guys go check out, obviously Noah at more parties, and especially as you mentioned, Nate Liss, he puts out a bunch of good stuff, as well as Matt
An
Harmon's
outraged
reception.
Jew, an outraged Jew on Twitter.
Yeah, and Matt Harmon's reception perception, he definitely puts out a lot of good stuff. I look for that every year. He definitely puts out a bunch of good stuff. a lot of we were talking about on the podcast a couple weeks ago. Deontay Johnson, a lot of his stuff, and I know Matt Harmon's been putting out a bunch of stuff for him.
Yeah.
Yeah. So now as you move more into just like we're in the dog days of the fantasy football dynasty season, and we're moving more towards dynasty mock drafts. I've seen you guys put out a couple of those. And it is kind of the consensus. The first like 6 picks we got, Bijan, and then we got the 3 quarterbacks, Bryce Young, Anthony Richardson, CJ Stroud, and we move towards like Jahmyr Gibbs and JSN, Jackson Smith and Jigba. And that's kind of like the consensus, whatever way you want to order those, but that's kind of like the top 6, with Bijan being at the top. Like, what position groups are you targeting now, more towards the end of the first round and more like moving into the second? Like where are you seeing a lot of these trends? Are you going running back heavy? Are you trying to take some of these receivers like Hyatt out of Tennessee or Josh Downs from North Carolina? Like what kind of prospects are you looking towards? Maybe there's a decent tight end class this year. So like what position groups are you looking more into as we approach the dynasty but mock draft season?
Yeah, I think like if I have my general rule of thumb right now as it relates to this class, I think this is an extremely underwhelming class just relative to the classes we've had previously.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm sitting there, somewhere in like the 108, 109, all the way down to probably like 205. I'm either looking to trade into that top tier of guys you named or back into the third round probably, or just out of this year all in general. Like if I could trade this year's 205 for a late first next year, or if I had to, package, that's probably not reasonable, but like package 2 seconds or some shit like that for next year's probably what I'm trying to do. This is a particularly tough class to evaluate pre-NFL draft. And I guess you could kind of say that for any year, but it's the fact that like most of the players left so much meat on the bone at the combine. They performed underwhelmingly athletically. So it's hard to get excited about all these guys unless Jalen Hyatt turns into, like there's a world where Downs, Flowers, and Hyatt all go as top 35 picks. There's a world where all of them go outside of the top 35 picks. So it's like, it's hard to compare the running backs and wide receivers right now because running backs, we have no fucking idea where any of these dudes are going to get drafted outside of Bijan, Gibbs, Charbonnet, and A-Chain are probably late second round picks, maybe third round picks. And at that point, like anything past that, it's hard to reasonably get excited about because objectively those are just not good capital to like rely on and bank on for success. So I think if I'm keeping that pick, probably go more heavy towards the wide receivers because I think they're better prospects. I think the draft capital will be much heavier there. So unless we get like a Kendre, jumping into the late second, early third round, hard to get excited about a lot of the running backs.
Yeah, I agree. It's kind of a weird year in terms of that. And obviously we kind of had a late spurt within the quarterback class, but obviously as we're moving down, these running backs is kind of a crapshoot, especially with the way that you mentioned that they performed at the combine. So I agree. I'll be targeting like, I forgot to mention Zay Flowers. He's also pretty good.
Yeah, there's like a group of 5 or 6 of them that I feel like are kind of the same player, and it's just going to be dictated by draft capital.
Exactly. Yeah, it'll be interesting to see, especially moving towards the draft season. It's obviously very much dependent on draft capital, as you mentioned.
Yeah.
So now let's move more into best ball strategies. I've been doing a couple of drafts myself. I know a lot of content creators are looking towards that as well on top of the dynasty mock drafts. And we're seeing like, and especially like, which I find is kind of insane, is we have like 4 or 5 quarterbacks taken within the first, 3 rounds, which is like, and then we got 8 moving within top 5 rounds. And as we've known, like, especially like JJ Zachariason, he kind of preached on his analysis of late round quarterback, but now we're seeing, especially in best ball, like all these, all these people are like, especially like, some of the people that won tournaments last year, they're trying to stack up these quarterback, wide receiver, tight end duos, like as soon as they get in the draft, and it's almost like too eager. So like, what is your approach now with kind of like the shift in this market, into your approach into best ball drafts?
Well, I actually can't really do best ball drafts at the moment right now because we worked with Underdog for a long time, and we didn't work with them last year, so we kind of moved away from doing the best ball stuff because I don't really want to draft on like FanDuel and DraftKings to do their best ball shit.
Makes sense.
But I think it's still relevant to like season long stuff, and not surprised by this shift whatsoever. I made a video I think like 3 months ago. It was like a hot take video. As soon as the season ended, I was like, "There's going to be 5 quarterbacks drafted inside the top 30 picks of one quarterback leagues next year." And I thought it was relatively obvious just how excited people were about quarterbacks by the end of last year. Like you couldn't really have a 1 QB team that went far without Jalen Hurts or Mahomes or Allen at the top of the tread there. So it was kind of obvious that it was going to move into this trend. It does feel something. It does feel like one of those trends that's so it's going to be so flocked to that like by next year it's going to be looked back on and be like, wow, this was kind of out of control. And I get it, like the top guys are performing at a level that we've never seen before, especially relative to like the mid-tier guys, because they're such good athletes. And it'll probably be a trend I'll do, but like I think in most drafts, instead of going with like Josh Allen or Mahomes in the second or early third, I'll probably go Fields in the fourth, or, you know, Lamar Jackson in the fourth or fifth or something like that, where these guys all have that upside that you don't have to actually spend that type of draft capital on. Maybe that's a sucker take, but I feel like as long as they have the upside to be where those other dudes are, I'm okay having that position kind of roll out in that sense.
Yeah, of course. And as you know, obviously Jalen Hurts took the jump that last year. You know, Mahomes was kind of being drafted late in the fourth, which we kind of should have expected was going to kind of come back to fruition. But, you know, some of these quarterbacks, it's definitely insane the draft capital that they have currently, and it's kind of a crapshoot, at least.
Yeah,
At
like
least
I'm looking at it now. Okay, so you can get, you know, what is it? Allen, Mahomes, Hurts are all second round picks.
yeah, which
Fields
is
is
insane.
crazy. Fields is a third round pick. Burrow's fourth. Lamar.
Burrow is like early second, like at the start, like right around the end of the Super Bowl. Like he was getting
That's
picked
wild.
because they were going, because it was Chase was like the 102 right now, like around that area. And then it's like people like to get the Higgins Burrow stack, which is like insane, like to consider that.
Yeah, dude, like I don't know. I like, of course I'd want one of those guys at the top of my team, but Lamar at 49, Herbert at 54, and Lawrence at 59. Like, is there anything more obvious that then Trevor Lawrence is going to take that like elite jump up this year, and you're going to get him 3 to 4 rounds later? Herbert with Kellen Moore there. I can't wait to see what that offense does. Lamar Jackson obviously has that crazy rushing upside. Like, I like all of those three dudes. And then you get the tier drop off where Deshaun Watson's 21 picks later. Like, obviously you don't want to rely on him because who knows if he's even good at football anymore. But you definitely want one of those like top 8 dudes. And the last 3 in that grouping is like super affordable.
Yeah, agreed. And yeah, we obviously, like, not to mention Tua, obviously, if he can stay healthy. He was amazing last year, you know, top right Tua to represent. Yeah, he was definitely playing at an unbelievable level last year, but obviously, like, it's still like, and his draft, I'm only mentioning him because his draft capital compared to everyone else is kind of insane, especially when you can get like even a guy like Tyreek and Waddle. Like, I'm not surprised. I actually am surprised that he's not being drafted earlier.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah. So now we're moving just more into like the external analytical sources that maybe you've obviously you mentioned before. You use PFF, and I saw one of your videos a while ago. You're using like stuff like Player Profile, which is like is an amazing tool to utilize. You know, lineups.com. You're just using a lot of volume statistics as well as keep trade cut, just to get like kind of like a market awareness of, you know, some guys in dynasty and redraft. What other sources maybe you're using, maybe on Reddit, maybe, you know, on Twitter? Like, what other analytical sources are you using more towards your analysis when going into the season?
Yeah, all those you mentioned are awesome. Sports Info Solutions is one I really like. I don't know if that's available to the public though, to be honest. It might be B2B. FF Today for like very basic stats for fantasy. Sharp Football Stats is actually really, really cool too. There's something that your squad over there might really like. They break everything down into like directions, part of the field, stuff like that. So Sharp Football Stats is really, really really in depth if you're looking for stuff like that. PFR is always great too if you're looking for anything historically like really weird and nuanced that you can't necessarily find. What else we got here? Yeah, that's probably, I got like a core, probably like 7 or 8 sources that I'll typically tread back and forth between to make sure what I'm thinking and saying line up.
Yeah, no, it's definitely some good points you make there about you know, like obviously you want to have as many sources as you possibly can, but you also don't want to overload yourself with too much analysis going into, because you could always over prepare for a draft.
Yeah, for a while,
player.
I was so crazy with content that when I started, I was like making sure I pulled every single source, every data point, arguing for myself, against myself. And there's a part of me now that's like, and I hate this, but I've adapted more of like how the modern day content works, you know, and I'm less incentivized to dive in to like to a really, really deep level as I would when I first started off. And now I'm like, okay, if I gather like 3 to 4 good points about a player that I like, that kind of gets my point across rather than going as deep as I possibly could. And I don't recommend that for people. The algorithm will tell you that that's the right way to go, quicker, less points, less deep or whatever. But I promise, if you're trying to build anything foundational, if you're trying to build something deep, if you're trying to build something worthwhile, I tweeted this out today because I heard it on a podcast. It was a quote that resonated with me. It says, the extra mile is never saturated. You know what I mean? Like, everything in content is extremely saturated. Any industry you go into, any platform you go to, but what's not saturated on those platforms are the people that are actually putting out quality content. And quality comes from preparation, like the depth of preparation.
That's a great point there. Yeah, definitely gonna have to use that into my analysis, at least like moving into it. You can't use too many stats moving within that. Now more to you, what you guys are doing. Obviously, you guys create a lot of content, on TikTok, on YouTube. Some more involved with fantasy football more than others. But how do you guys at BDG, obviously you mentioned you don't want to use too many stats, but how are you moving forward as the fantasy football community is becoming more analytical, depending on more of those stats, moving into it? How do you guys at BDG expect try to utilize these stats moving forward within analytics?
Yeah, I think what I think is lost in this space a lot of the time is that we have people who are like good at making content, and we have people who are really analytically sound. There are very few people that can marry the two. Like, being able to communicate what you're saying in a normal, like, you feel like you're watching another human and you're interacting and you feel comfortable watching them type of way is equally, if not more important than the actual numbers you're giving off. So I would make sure that you find your zone as it relates to being a content creator. Like, find where you're comfortable, find how you feel good presenting yourself and expressing yourself through, the mic or the camera or via blogging or whatever platform it is. And then worry about having all the stats and numbers, because if you just rip off stats, numbers, analytics and stuff like that, I promise, like, no one's going to want to hear you out. But if you can come across as a normal person and be like, okay, I like this dude, he can probably give me what I need in a way that I could actually digest and understand, that's the way I look at it. Like, if I had to lean 51-49 one way, the communication is certainly in the heavier side of that for me, because I would never want to just go on and spew out a bunch of numbers. So again, it goes back to like what I think is contextual, what I think is real, what I think actually matters, and then making sure that I can present that in a way that people can understand.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. Obviously, like, you want to be able to display what you're trying to say in terms of, kind of the stats you want to provide to your audience. And it's just as important as providing those right stats. So I totally agree with you. And, one last question before we wrap it up here. What kind of advice may you have for people that want to get into a similar career path as you? Obviously, you kind of took a different route in comparison to some of the other content creators, but obviously everyone has their own way, like, especially emerging into the fantasy community or just content creation as a whole. Like, what kind of advice do you have for someone that wants to get, involved in this?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think like the way I went about it is a good path for people who have like very high ambitions or aspirations. Like, not everybody needs to run a business, and not everybody, needs to try to hit these lofty goals. Your goal might just be to work full-time in sports media. And you could do that in a lot of ways. You can be a full-time creator. You can make your own brand or business, but there are a ton of companies that hire for this stuff. And I think the thing that most people get lost on is like, man, I want to be a content creator. It's like, make fucking content. Like, in what world, like, do you not need to have a portfolio in order to get the job that you want to get? You would never try to be an artist. You would never try to be a video editor. You would never try to be all of these things without being like, here's the work that I've done in this field. And these social platforms give you are literally like the portfolio skeleton of what you need to do. If you create a TikTok, if you create a YouTube channel, if you create a Twitter, whatever it is, however you want to grow your audience, that's your portfolio right there. I promise you, jobs and brands and companies don't care what school you went to. They don't care what program you're in. They care about the content that you're providing. If you're going to be a content creator, they want to see the content that you create. Like that, it doesn't go any further than that. And people put all this unimportant stuff, on a pedestal that doesn't matter in the real world. I would much rather see someone who has I don't even want to say a big following, because big following doesn't matter. Big following, what it typically will show me is that they're passionate about what they're doing and they've put the work in. Longevity is really important. that they're not burnt out, that they do like what they're talking about, that they're fine showing up consistently, like day in and day out, in order to grow. So it's like, make content. If you want to be a fucking content creator, any job you want to do the job that you want to do without actually having the job that you want to do. And also look at yourself as a marketer first. Platforms in the same way that I just said, like, communication is the 51-49 over the actual analytics. Marketing is the 51-49 over whatever fucking job you want to do. Understand the platforms, understand where you can grow, build an audience, build your leverage point. That's what it is. Build wherever your leverage point is, and then the world is yours, realistically.
Couldn't have said it any better myself. And coming from a content creator yourself, obviously you've grown your brand exponentially. And, I'm very much looking forward to see how you guys expand more on social media, more through as a brand as a whole. And I can't wait to see you guys expand it further. But yeah, thank you so much, Nick, for hopping on. Make sure you guys all follow him. BDG, Big Dogs Gotta Eat, Nick Ercolano on Twitter. We'll provide some of those links within, on Twitter and all our other socials. Nick, be on the lookout for the podcast, and thanks for coming on. I really appreciate you for jumping on with us.
Hell yeah. Thanks for having me, Chris. I had a blast.